What's up, friends, and welcome into Fantasy Pros, the football podcast. I'm Chris Welsh. That's Pat Fitzmaurice. We got Billy Muzio in the house, and we are talking wide receiver ranks for week 6. Are you ready? I know you are. We've got wide receiver 1s, 2s, 3s. Maybe those guys are going to jump into the flex. We've got the debates, the battles, and where the ranks are at. You guys want to check out the ranks as they adjust all season long? Go to fantasypros.com/rankings, and you can see the ECR ranks. Our consensus rankers across hundreds. We have 100 plus consensus rankers that make these ranks up. They do change throughout the week. So just as an FYI, as we're going through this, you might see some slight ups and downs. Or of course, if there's a big, massive change, like Nico Collins going on the IR, that's not great. And obviously that's going to be even more of a little boost for guys like Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs. Make sure you go and check out fantasypros.com/rankings so you can see all the updates. Gentlemen, let's jump into this with the wide receiver ranks for week 6. Let's go to the big board. Over on Fantasy Pros, we've got CeeDee Lamb coming in as the number 1 wide receiver for the week. Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors back, thank you. Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jaden Reed. That's your top 5 right now. Drake London, A.J. Brown, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, followed by Chris Godwin, Brandon Aiyuk, and Stephon Diggs. That rounds out our top 12 wide receivers this week. Usually we don't sit at home too long on these wide receiver ones, but I do have 2 things I want to hit. Let's talk about Drake London for a second. Drake London has an ECR of 6, but we've got a discrepancy here. Fitz, you got him right around ECR, but Billy, you got him a bit lower. We're picking at things here because you still have him as a wide receiver 1, but just curious, Billy, he almost falls out of that wide receiver 1 territory. Is this I don't want to overreact to that 1 week? That happens with Drake London. And I mean, Kirk Cousins, 500 plus yards is not going to happen every week. Just curious your take on Drake London being quite a bit lower than consensus ECR.
No, I like Drake London. He's one of my most owned wide receivers, and you got to like the volume. You've seen 93% of the routes, 27% of the target share. It just breaks down the game script for me. I mean, Atlanta Falcons are 6-point favorites at Carolina. I think this game could get away from them, and I could see this being a second half, where they lean into Bijan and Tyler Algier, and they kind of not necessarily abandon the passing game, but probably scale it back unless they absolutely have to. And so I think this is just going to be a potential lower passing attempts, and they're just going to continue to beat them on the ground just because Carolina can be beaten pretty much anywhere. And so I think that it just breaks down to volume of this certain game and how I kind of foresee the game script going.
So, Pat, I'm actually not going to ask you about Drake London. I want to ask you about the other wide receiver we're going to hit in this range. Because, again, these are the questions of what's going to be out there for like a top 12 wide receiver. Like, these are must starts. Most people are at least playing, obviously, in 2 wide receiver league, if not 3 with multiple flexes. So there's not a lot of question. But what I do think is interesting is Brandon Aiyuk is back, at least in the consensus rankers circle of trust. My question is, he's at 11. Is he back in your circle of trust after 4 weeks of looking awful? And then all of a sudden you had the big game, which does happen with Aiyuk. Usually it happens a little bit more than what we're seeing. But did that one big game change the scope? And is he back in your circle of trust?
I would say he's back in my circle of trust, Welsh, but with a caveat. And that caveat is just that we know Brandon Aiyuk is not going to get Drake London type target volume. He averaged about 6.5 targets a game last year. And the reason he got to 1,300 yards in 2023 was because he was just freakishly efficient with yards per target, yards per route run. Now, Aiyuk is a well above average wide receiver, so it's reasonable to expect well above average efficiency, but probably not at the freaky level we saw last year. And look, with Deebo Samuel and George Kittle around, there are just going to be weeks when the target volume isn't there and Aiyuk doesn't have a very good game. And I shouldn't forget Juwan Jennings. I don't want Billy mad at me as a 49ers fan for forgetting about their stud number 3 receiver. There just aren't going to be enough targets and receptions to go around every week. But I do think Aiyuk is back to being probably a top 20 play most weeks.
Billy, are you this week Deebo or Aiyuk?
I would first like to preface that it's Juwan Moss Jennings inside the Muzio household. But I have Deebo slightly ahead of Aiyuk this week. I have them both inside the top 8 actually at the wide receiver position. This is a a week where I think that the Niners get it right in the passing game. And I like both as a play this week. And I don't think that you can knock either. I mean, to Pat's point, 1 week it's Debo, 1 week it's Aiyuk, sometimes it's both. With Kittle a little banged up, I think that this could be, double wide receiver week. And so, Mason's always in play as well. But Shanahan offense, you can never really quite say what's going to happen. But I do think that both receivers have as good of a chance to finish into the top 10 as anybody does.
I mean, that's a big one. They can both play really well until the Niners give it up in the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter, like they love to do this year. You don't sleep on Juwan Jennings. I actually have a couple leagues where people are starting to cut Juwan Jennings. I am a little selly on Brandon Aiyuk right now. I'm in agreement with Billy with watching this 49ers team for a long time. I think this is a Debo bounce back game, and Brandon Aiyuk will sit back a little bit. And I think they're also going to try to get the ball back into Juwan Jennings' hands, and he plays the best on the deep ball. And I think they'll play that a little bit more against Seattle. Let's go to the wide receiver twos. This is wide receivers 13 through 24. A little bit more questions here. At 13, we've got Marvin Harrison with the Cardinals leads out our wide receiver twos, followed by Garrett Wilson, Debo at 15. So you can see the consensus ranks discrepancy there. Mike Evans, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, Terry McLaurin, Dionate Johnson comes in at 20, followed by Chris Olave, Devontae Smith, Jamison Williams, and Amari Cooper rounds out those wide receiver twos. We've got some questions in here, and let's start with Mike Evans. And we're starting with Mike Evans because you both are below consensus on him. He started at 14 like a day ago. He's already moved down to 16. So as more rankers, I just want to point out, as more rankers have submitted, his rank has jumped down, or I guess it fell a few spots here. You guys were already there. So Pat, let's start with you. Mike Evans has been kind of a disappointment off of that big touchdown game. He has been very high touchdown equity for his scoring. We've seen a lot more of Chris Godwin, and the Bucs have kind of been up and down. I don't want to make this a long season type of thing because this is a weekly rank show, but I feel like there is a growing pessimism with Mike Evans every week that he's not having those breakout games, that people are becoming a little bit more jaded. Do you feel that he is becoming the true number 2 behind Chris Godwin, or do you think this is kind of 49er-ish where they're going to start? It's been more Chris Godwin, but usually they'll pass it back and forth. Do you think that back and forth will happen between their value, or is this just Chris Godwin and then Mike Evans clear number 2?
No, I do think it's going to oscillate week to week as to which one is more valuable, Evans or Godwin. My fading of Evans this week is more matchup specific. So here are the last 6 stat lines for Mike Evans against the Saints dating back to 2021. 3 catches for 70 yards, 3 for 40, 4 for 59, 3 for 61, 1 for 14, and 3 for 61. Again, no touchdowns in any of those 6 games. Marshawn Lattimore has been a really tough matchup for Mike Evans. Dennis Allen clearly does not want Mike Evans to beat him when the Saints go against the Buccaneers. So that's kind of my reason for fading Evans this week.
What's interesting talking about this too is when you get into the wide receiver 18, 19, 20, for these leagues that are playing 2 wide receivers out there, there's legitimate chances that some of these guys might not be starters. Take, for instance, a guy like T. Higgins on that list. He comes in at 18. That would have been somebody, people could have drafted as a 3rd or 4th wide receiver. And, there's a legitimate question that a guy like, T. Higgins could be played over him. So I say this to you, Billy. Do you think the same concerns, you share the same concerns with Pat about Mike Evans, and that maybe it might be worthwhile finding some of these the guys that have been perpetually under him, like T. Higgins, like Terry McLaurin, maybe Dionate Johnson? Are you wanting to start starting some of those guys over Mike Evans?
Yeah, I probably would. I mean, Mike Evans and Marshawn Lattimore have history. I mean, I want to go back and look at if they fought more than how many times we've seen Mike Evans score touchdowns versus him. Because anytime these two face, there's always a chance they get ejected, honestly. And it's just, I always have it in the back of my mind. And they, like to Pat's point, they face him tough, and Mike Evans gets frustrated. They take it on each other. They literally get suspended. They fight. They throw fists. This is not usually a matchup that I usually like to start Mike Evans in. And I usually, honestly, I bench him every single year they face each other just because we know they have that history. And Marshawn Lattimore knows how to get in his head. And when you can get inside somebody's head in football, you own them. And he owns Mike Evans right now, and I'm not going to be playing him.
Little bit of a fade. A lot of people are fading throughout the season as weeks and weeks have gone by. And Garrett Wilson, then he has this really big performance. This is the kind of like Aiyuk, it's circle of trust type of thing. Like he jumped back up, ECR 14, nothing crazy though this week, but that's a high end wide receiver too. But this is a discrepancy place for you too. Fitz, you've got him at 11. Billy, you've got him at 20. So that's pretty big gap between there. Billy, your gap of ECR to where you've got him is probably the biggest. So talk to us about what doesn't have you. You're not excited about Mike Evans, also kind of not excited about Garrett Wilson after that huge big blow up. And I'd point out, like mentioned with running backs, that we have new coaching, and usually you get back to basics. That's an oversimplification, but getting back to basics for a Jets offense would be two things. It would be Breece Hall, and it would be Garrett Wilson. Get the ball in those guys' hands and make the big plays. So that would be something you would be hoping for. But lay it out for us. Garrett Wilson at wide receiver 20 for you.
Yeah, people might think it's a little crazy. He got 22 targets last week, and I have him at wide receiver 20 now. But it just breaks down to, these efficiency and how much are they? I don't think they're going to give him another 22 targets. I'd be surprised to see him even hit 13 or 14. But it just, for me, it's, even with those 22 targets, he barely hit 100 receiving yards. He only had 13 receptions. Him and Rodgers don't seem to be on the same page. Rodgers seems to lean into Lazard quite a bit, especially in the red zone. So I think that Garrett Wilson, yes, I like the volume that we saw last week, but we're talking now about a team that is trying to find itself. There's a lot of drama in the clubhouse. I think Garrett Wilson's probably a little frustrated as well. Rodgers kind of proved a point, gave him a ton of targets, and quite frankly, Garrett Wilson didn't capitalize on it. And so I could see Rodgers doing what Rodgers does and spreading the ball around. And to your point, maybe they get the running backs more involved again this week, and it's in particular Breece Hall. So I just think that it's people are overreacting to the 22 target game, and rightfully so. But at the same time, if you can't capitalize on it, there's no reason for them to keep giving him all those targets. And so I love Garrett Wilson, but it's starting to look like he was, a missed pick inside round one this year.
It's kind of the same question as I asked you with Aiyuk. Pat, is Garrett Wilson back in the circle of trust? You've got him at 11, so you've got him as a wide receiver 1 this week.
It's funny. I also ranked him as a wide receiver 1 last week, and I've got him inside wide receiver 1 range this week. Yeah, it was weird that he had the 22 targets and 100 plus yards last week, but we're looking at it as kind of in some ways a negative performance because he averaged under 5 yards per target, which is strange when you are a 100-yard receiver in any given week. But I guess for me, I fundamentally have not really changed my outlook on Garrett Wilson that much from where it was this summer when I viewed him as sort of a mid-range wide receiver 1 and people were taking him late in the first round. I think if we redrafted today, he's going maybe closer to the round 2, round 3 turn than the round 1, round 2 turn. But I still think of him as a low-end wide receiver 1. I know it hasn't been great with Garrett Wilson and Aaron Rodgers so far, but I still think that Wilson is one of the best receivers in the league and that there are going to be games where this works really well.
Let's do a rank battle of these of this wide receiver 2 range between two guys that I think are just really interesting as far as like the trust factor. Dionate Johnson got everybody, as soon as Andy Dalton took over, hey, we're back. Dionate Johnson, let's go. And then last week, everything kind of fell apart and it seems like people are really ready to jump off versus Terry McLaurin, who Jaden Daniels is back to unlocking the offense. The only thing I would point out about McLaurin is there's not a ton of volume. It has been big plays. So like McLaurin is being saved by these big plays, but that also isn't something you would take away from Jaden Daniels because he's like massively efficient. So this week, Dionate Johnson is at 20 and you've got Terry McLaurin at 19 right next to each other. So I had to look at that. Terry McLaurin completely disappeared. Great separation rate of my eyes to the ranks there. Pat, let's start with you. Dionate Johnson versus Terry McLaurin for this week.
I've got McLaurin wide receiver 18 and Dionate wide receiver 21, and it's largely about matchup for me. The Ravens are a big-time pass funnel defense. They're great against the run. They've been giving it up big time to wide receivers. The third most fantasy points allowed to opposing wideouts. And whereas Dionate Johnson is probably going to be seeing a lot of A.J. Terrell this weekend, one of the better cover corners in the league. And I suppose I'd also rather have the guy who's tied to Jaden Daniels than the guy who's tied to Andy Dalton.
I mean, mic drop, I suppose, with that last comment right there. Billy, same thing. Dionate Johnson versus Terry McLaurin for you this week.
For me, it's Dionate. It just breaks down to the volume, also how I kind of expect this game to go. Baltimore. So the way I like to look at this is Baltimore is facing Jaden Daniels. What a better way to prepare for Jaden Daniels than with Lamar Jackson? Both these guys are able to make plays with their legs, extend the offense, and I think that Baltimore is going to be probably the ones who played Jaden Daniels probably the toughest, and I could see him struggling this week just because of that. For them having that preparedness, and so I like Dionate Johnson's volume. Last week was a bit of a little bit lower than expected, but he's seeing 28% of the targets on the season. Expect them to be behind this game, throwing most of the second half.
Gentlemen, it's halftime, so let's huddle up here for a minute because we have got to talk about a player who hasn't been delivering as we've expected up until this past week, and that's Garrett Wilson, who we just talked about. Drafted high, full of potential, full of huge potential, but so far, it's been a lot of missed opportunities and some shaky performances until 22 targets. So Garrett Wilson, this is your wake-up call. It's time to dig in, find the spark, and finish strong. No more excuses, no more half measures. Your real team and our fantasy teams need you to step up, and the time is now to turn things around, just like how Garrett needs to get back to basics. So does your lawn. Bet you didn't know fall is the perfect time to feed your lawn and set it up for success next season. Recover from the summer heat and prep for winter with Scott's Turf Builder Winter Guard. This isn't about waiting for spring. It's about taking action today. Feed your lawn Scott's Turf Builder Winter Guard this fall to build strong, deep grass roots. Strengthen for winter and prep for a better spring. Just like how we're rooting for Garrett Wilson to come back stronger, make sure your lawn does too. So don't wait. Pick up a bag of Scott's Turf Builder Winter Guard today. Feed your lawn. Feed it. All right, let's get to wide receivers 25 to 36, wide receiver 3s/flex. One of my favorite players and was in my buy this week. Brian Thomas Jr. is taking a big step up, but it just didn't really happen with the rankers. It is a tough-ish defense against Chicago matchup. 26 is Michael Pittman Jr., followed by Darnell Mooney, George Pickens, Dontavian Wicks, still circle of trust, at 29. Jackson Smith and Jigba, and then the final 31 to 36, Rashid Shaheed, Christian Kirk, Wan'Dale Robinson, Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, and Josh Downs. Let's start with Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney has got that ECR of 27. Billy, you're at 28. Fitz, you're at 25. Billy, let's start with you. We're seeing these big passing performances that are going to come out of Atlanta. And what we know is it's not just Drake London. And we see some high Drake London ranks in here. Darnell Mooney is becoming like a legit, if at worst, a great wide receiver 4, like the top guy to put in off of bye weeks and stuff like that. But, this level of performance, do you think Darnell Mooney really is pushing up? You've got a pretty fair rank of it, so that kind of answers that. But let's get your take on Darnell Mooney.
Yeah, it's a guy that every week I talk about possibly putting in my lineup, but I just can never make the argument to do so. And every week I look at him on the bench with like 16 to 17 points, and it's infuriating because he usually outscores Pickens or somebody else I have up there. But he's definitely becoming very reliable. I mean, his volume is consistent. I mean, this is a guy who's seeing 24% of the targets. He's seeing 97% of the routes on the season. And when they cover Drake London or they're, not running the ball, it's Darnell Mooney time. And so, I want to push him up higher in the ranks. I think he might move up slightly a little bit, probably in that 25, 24 range, most likely back in wide receiver 2 this week with given the buys, but I can't make an argument against them. And I think I might be a little low looking at where I'm at right now.
Fitzy, you've almost got him as a wide receiver 2. You got him at 25 and maybe something's going to push you up there. Wide receiver 2 is a big statement for Darnell Mooney moving forward.
Yeah, I don't want to seem like I'm overreacting to a game in which he had 16 targets in this like ridiculously souped up pass happy game script for the Falcons where Kirk Cousins had 58 pass attempts. But Mooney has been consistently involved, as Billy mentioned, at least 6 targets in each of his last 4 games. And his average depth of target is 12.3 yards. So these are pretty high value targets. I guess it has been hard to wrap myself around the idea that like Darnell Mooney is this borderline wide receiver 2, but I think that's kind of where we're at with him.
Yeah, seeing like Darnell Mooney over Christian Kirk or Calvin Ridley. It's just kind of like an eye opener, but the performance is out there. Man, if there was a player in the first couple weeks that you look at some of the underlying stuff and you're like, we're ready for breakout time, but then it just falls flat, it's George Pickens, because George Pickens just a big play option. Obviously, the Pittsburgh Steelers offense just a little bit weird in how they're running, and Arthur Smith is there and whatnot. But Pickens this past week, we saw like snaps go down. And why was he not getting that big workload? Why were they not throwing the ball deep to him enough? He's getting, I guess, maybe I view this as a little bit of a benefit of the doubt that he's still inside the top 30 this week, ECR 28. But you guys are both all in. You guys both have him at wide receiver 2 here. So, Fitz, let's start with you. This is a really bad performance from Pickens this past week, but it's also, I mean, maybe this is the positive. It's not really about like him. It seems to be more about the offense that's holding him back. But that's like the problem is like, how do I bounce back off of that offense, not getting him involved and him losing some snaps?
Yeah, so I've got him at wide receiver 22 this week, and Billy just talked about maybe wishing he had played Darnell Mooney over George Pickens some of these weeks. We haven't seen Pickens score a touchdown yet, and terrible game for him last week against the Cowboys. There have been a lot of people putting up videos on Twitter of Pickens from that game looking like he was dogging it on some of these plays. But hey, the Steelers have one good wide receiver. And it's George Pickens, who we know is just this exceptional playmaker, one of the best contested catch artists in the league. And he is playing the Raiders, who have a very shaky group of cornerbacks. It just feels like a get right spot to me.
What do you think, Billy? You were upset about starting Pickens over Mooney last week, but you're doing it again. So is a little hesitation? Do you want to maybe get him out of that lineup? You said you wanted to move Mooney up a little bit. Is that enough for you?
Yeah, I agree with Pat. I think it's a get right game. He's frustrated. We saw kind of the bickering on the sideline and the I'd say the drama between him and Tomlin and the offense right now in his role. It's something to monitor because Tomlin will put somebody in their place, and Pickens is a bit of a hothead at times, and so it's a volume thing for me right now. He's just not getting. I mean, this is not a high volume pass attempt offense, and so Pickens is getting his share though, 27% of the season on average on his targets, and he's out there running for the most part. Outside of last week, he'd seen 81% of the routes or more on any given week, and so I like his involvement. I just have a bit of hesitation right now with the quarterback situation and how much they're throwing.
Yeah, I get a little bit worried because the thing you love about Pickens is like he's a great deep play guy. And I kind of thought this like Cowboy game, like, oh, this would be great. Like they're probably going to be playing from behind and they might get some deep shots. We just didn't see it really going there. So you start to worry. I'm not saying he's becoming Antonio Pierce with the Colts or anything like that, but we're not getting too far from that either. Like we need the volume catches from George Pickens. Let's jump into a little debate, a battle here. I'm a little surprised to see Dontavian Wicks. I know he's probably going to be high on the cut list after last week, but obviously with Dobbs in the doghouse, like Wicks is still there to get some potential volume. It just didn't happen last week. Wicks versus Downs. Downs had a massive target share. He's their slot safety guy. Maybe this is even a Flacco versus Richardson question long-term, but Billy, let's start with you. Josh Downs or Wicks this week?
It's Josh Downs for me. I mean, this is a huge separation for me. I mean, Josh Downs is seeing, bulk of the touches, honestly. He's seeing 30% of the targets in his offense. He's actually getting more than Michael Pittman, who said 25%. He's making the most of it, though. He's only seeing 70% of the routes on any given week. But he seems to be consistently performing and seems to be consistently getting the ball. And this is kind of like a Wan'Dale Robinson situation where he's, being targeted heavily and often, and his yards per reception are just extremely low. We're talking about 20 receptions for only 157 yards on the season. So I do, though, like him over Wicks, especially, the word is Romeo is back this week. And so that's going to move Wicks down significantly more for me.
Pat, the ECR does not agree with that statement. Wicks is significant. I don't know what you consider significant, but they're in the same range of wide receiver 3, but there's like 7 spots of difference. You're a Packer fan. Are you going to be tempted on Wicks here, or are you going to go against the grain and take the Josh Downs over Dontavian?
No, I do have Wicks 3 spots higher. I've got him wide receiver 31. I've got Downs wide receiver 34. I know a lot of people are ready to jump ship on Wicks after it didn't happen for him in a really good matchup against the Rams last week, but Here we are with another good matchup for Wicks this week against the Cardinals in Green Bay. I think it's a pretty good spot. They're still not going to have Christian Watson, presumably. Maybe they get Romeo Doubs back, but the target outlook should still be pretty decent for Wicks, and he does get high-value targets downfield. Billy mentioned it with Downs, and that's my thing with him. The volume has been great, but he is just not he doesn't do much with those catches. He needs that volume because he's averaging under 10 yards per catch. And here's the thing, I'm basing my rankings of Downs based on the assumption that Joe Flacco will play for the Colts. If Anthony Richardson plays for the Colts, Downs is not even startable, in my opinion. And it's not that I don't like Anthony Richardson as a fantasy commodity, but is in terms of what he does for his wide receivers, it is a big downgrade if you go from Flacco to A-Rich.
We're going to do one more on the wide receivers here, and this is going to be a price check because the ECR has not caught up. I guess it was probably waiting for news. And what I'm referring to is Tank Dell, because about a day ago, Tank Dell was sitting around the 50s in ECR. Well, I think we all kind of thought Nico was going to be out, but I don't think everybody was really playing that card. Well, now we know he's out. We know he's going to be out, and it's Diggs and Tank Dell. So the price check is going to be how ECR is going to change over the next couple of days. Both of you fine gentlemen have already been ranking him, it looks like, assuming that Nico was out and maybe had made the adjustment when IR happened. Billy, you've got him at 24. Fitz, you've got him at 28. Billy, you've got him as a wide receiver too. I'm with you on that one. I'm pretty high on Tank. I think this is going to be the get right game for Tank Dell. We haven't seen that really great connection between him and Stroud so far. I think this is going to be that one. Are you in agreement?
Yeah, and now we have 25% of the target share up for grabs. He was already seeing 16%, so now we're pushing him closer to 23, most likely, if not higher. Stephon Diggs probably going to be closer to 27, 28%. So both these guys are going to be, far above the 20% target range. And we're talking about 90% of the routes and being on the field, probably close to 100% of the snaps. So gotta love the volume that we're going to see with Tank Dell. We've seen Tank Dell step up when they've been down receivers. I think he does it again. This is the guy I'm going to be pretty comfortable to rank into the top 24 on a week-to-week basis as long as Nico's on IR.
And I'm the same way. I think interesting, Pat, is you've got Pickens technically over him right now. And I think I would take the second wide receiver on the Texans than the first wide receiver on the Pittsburgh Steelers right now, especially with Tank's big playability, because that's also what Pickens is all about. I think there's even a potential better volume share with Tank Dell. Didn't really mean to make this about Pickens again. This is more about your optimism of where you think this is going with Tank Dell, though.
Yeah, and I do think he is a start for most people under most circumstances this week. The fact that both of you guys are outflanking me on Tank Dell in the rankings. Yeah, I probably should ranked a little better, but still inside the top 30 for me. Just a big play guy. And we know how much CJ Stroud loves him. And now with Nico out and the target outlook brightening considerably for Tank Dell, yeah, he's a good play this week.
Well, if you guys are looking for more of this, the start sit, and when I'm kind of getting in some battles here of who these guys have and you're getting their ranks, we got you covered, because don't forget, we've got this weekly start and sit live stream on our YouTube channel where you can come, you can ask specific questions, start and sit questions, whatever it is. It can be a rank of versus. We'll be with you every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And for those listening on the podcast, go to youtube.com/fantasypros, subscribe, click the bell so you're notified so you don't miss any of those live streams. Wide receiver ranks for week 6 in the books.